Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of FiST Chat, the podcast that features discussions on the topics of film, science and technology. My name is Ben Warner and I'm joined once again by my good friend and colleague Steve Kern to talk about the wonderful new Apple iPhone 4S. Are you excited by this, Steve?
Well, you know, the funny thing is I wasn't at first, but now I can't wait to get my hands on one. That might be because I currently own a phone that nobody else wants to own.
There's always that, yeah. But you kind of tapped into something there, this idea that the kind of reaction that the phone got off the bat was kind of a letdown or a disappointment, that they didn't unveil some new phone that would catapult them that much further ahead.
I blame Apple for that because they let that out. They wanted to get everyone excited and they probably overdid it. I mean, the features, I have no doubt, in fact, that the iPhone 5 exists now. And originally the iPhone 4S was rumoured, I think, to come out in April or March of this year as an intermediate. So, who knows what it is? Is it a question of economics and they've got too many iPhone 4 shells left over? So just update the OS?
Or on the more giving the benefit of the doubt side, there's this idea that whatever new technologies they wanted to put into the iPhone 5 they haven't been able to perfect yet. And supposedly one of Apple's mantras there is that if it's not ready, don't release it.
Yeah, well, I prefer to go with that one, actually.
But I mean, just as an example, I'll put this article up on Facebook later, but just as a quote, it's been 16 months since the iPhone 4's debut, and all you've got is an A5 processor in the existing iPhone 4.
Who writes that rubbish?
Apple's stock price dropped 0.6% after the announcement, more than the broader market. But what's with all the long faces after all? I mean, maybe what about the fact that maybe they got so much of it right with the original iPhone 4 to begin with, and if you look at their sort of roadmap, it's sort of following what they've done in the past with the iPhone 3G and the iPhone 3GS, in that they deliver a incremental update every other year, and they deliver the big one every second year, and that's supposedly in line with the 2-year contracts you get with carriers.
Yeah, look, and I tend to think that you're right. And the 4S, okay, maybe really the only real feature that there's a huge improvement will not just be the operating system, but probably the camera and the fact that you can shoot high def on it. That aside, I think it's quite interesting here in Australia. I've noticed that they've okayed the NFF technology, which is the chip inside the phone that allow you to make purchases.
Oh, yeah.
So the fact that hadn't been ratified perhaps is something that's held Apple up. I mean, I've got no doubt that iPhone 5 will actually be a game changer once again, probably as much as the 4 was.
Yeah.
And I think within that, a bit like you're saying, there's also reason for Apple to hold off. There's no need at the moment. There's been no real big driver or improvement in technology really from the Android market either, in terms of phone technology. So they can afford to hold off for another cycle.
Well, and the argument there too is that the Apple was kind of playing a little bit of catch up in the sense of so a lot of the Android phones, for example, have gone further ahead in terms of the hardware and the software and what they're capable of. Like, for example, the notification center that's coming with iOS 5 is long overdue for the iPhone, whereas the Androids had that for quite some time. You mentioned the higher res camera. A lot of the Android phones have had that for quite some. Apparently, there's some with 12 megapixel cameras out there.
Wow!
So in that sense, you could argue that they're catching up, but at the same time,
12 megapixel cameras with a crappy little lens.
Exactly.
Why bother?
Exactly. But I think, again, if we're looking at Apple's mantra on a lot of this stuff, is that it's not, they try not to emphasize the specs too much, even though of course they came out and said, oh, we've got an A5 dual core processor running this thing and whatever. They don't tend to emphasize these things because, as far as they're concerned, as long as the sum of all of this stuff working together, as long as it works really, really well, it doesn't really matter that it's not the fastest or the biggest spec or anything like that.
Completely agree with you. And in fact, I think that iOS 5 has been underrated or underplayed in the role it will. And you've just outlined, the sort of update it'll bring. I think, look, let's be honest, that some of the other manufacturers have got very nice Android phones and they're very good. I mean, they're approaching, what you'd expect from Apple, but they're still not quite there. And the iPhone, no matter what you say about its componentry, I think, having a look at some of the apps that are available for Android and OS, I think you'll see that the Apple's still got the edge.
Yeah, of course. And I guess the only fun thing to say on all of this is that because the form factor itself hasn't changed at all, I guess those tech fashionistas out there are not going to be happy that, they can't go around saying, oh, I've got an iPhone 4S and just show it to people and they'll know that it's an iPhone 4S.
That's personally why I think maybe Apple just had an oversupply of cases.
Well, I actually thought it made great business sense to do this because it doesn't, like, production-wise, it makes it a lot easier for them. They just have to produce the same case. I mean, that's obviously right. All the internals are different, but it doesn't matter. It's still the same case.
I always had a theory, though, that's why they were still producing Emacs long after they needed to.
Absolutely.
Maybe that's why we've still got iPhone GS3.
That's right. Just one other thing, one other feature I wanted to quickly touch on was the Siri voice recognition software that was advertised as the massive new feature of the phone. Now, I loved some of the comments that suggested that it was like the beginnings of Skynet, and soon, I guess Apple's going to turn out their own brand of Terminator or something like that. But it's a nice sort of feature, and they got that cool video of that guy and that girl talking to the phone, and it's talking back to them.
Did I hear you right, Ben? A nice sort of feature. I saw one tweet, and I wish I could credit it to someone who just said, now, after years of enduring listening to people talking on their phones in public places, we're now going to have to listen to them talking to their phones. Oh, jeez.
Yeah, that can't be good for anybody.
No, that can't be good for anyone.
So it's interesting that you think it might have just been... do you think that this would eventually have some sort of... practical application, you think, or is it more on the gimmick side?
Well, I don't know. I mean, this gimmick has been around for a long time. Nokia has had it for maybe 10 years. You got a touch screen now. You don't need buttons. Do you really need voice? I mean, people text so they don't have to talk to people. Is it possible to text Siri to let Siri know what you want, so you don't have to talk to them?
Well, apparently you can just, say text whoever and what. Oh, I don't know. I can't imagine if I had this feature. I can't imagine ever using it, to be honest, because the interface with the phone is more than enough for me.
To be honest, though, if you're in a car, very useful. So I can see it becoming useful. But for God's sake, people, please don't use Siri in a public place.
Can you imagine, all those people in the library or something like that?
Oh, goodness.
Please find me the latest book or whatever. Now, okay, well, how about we have so maybe just to round that out, I think another thing is this idea that Apple just can't keep rolling out the wow announcement, the type of announcement that gets people, the jaws drop and like, oh my God, what an amazing thing. I think it gets to a point where they can't keep doing that because it's going to get so good that, it can't be that fantastic. And, sadly, obviously with Steve Jobs passing away last week, we can't really tell this, but you can imagine that even if he was still there for another 20 years, that even he couldn't spin it that much further. And
there are good reasons for that, though. I mean, just look at the chip technology for phone payment. remote phone payment. Apple could have probably put that in 10 years ago. But if your credit card companies and your banks don't have the infrastructure in, you can have it in your phone, but it's not gonna go anywhere.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I think there's as much of the market having to catch up with some of these innovations as much as, just because Apple was sitting on their hands.
That's right. Yeah. All right, let's put the phone in context with its competition. We mentioned briefly that in some ways they were playing a little bit of catch up. It's probably on par with the top phones out there at the moment. But it's also, I think, you have to kind of describe it in terms of the ecosystems that all these phones provide and the experience that they give you. And again, it's the idea that Apple doesn't necessarily have to have the fastest, most whiz-bang tech specs in the phone. Android tends to kind of sort of leapfrog over them in terms of that. But Android comes, I guess, with its own sort of pitfalls as well. And I guess maybe I'm speaking from my own biased opinion here, but it's, to me, I've always felt like an Android phone was like an 80s or a 90s PC. If you're a tech guy and you like to configure everything down to the last sort of minute feature, then go for your Android. But if you want something where you're not having to think about using it, then that's where the iPhone really wins.
Yeah. I don't know much about Android, but it's frightening to know that you could have that much ability to have to rebuild your desktop every 3 months.
Absolutely. And to bring in Microsoft with Windows Phone, one thing I do really appreciate with Windows Phone, and before we talk about Windows Phone, should point out that Microsoft makes more money off of patents related to Android than it does off Windows Phone.
Wow!
Apparently,
at the moment,
at the moment, it's apparently that I've heard it described as their new $1 billion business, because every time a new Android phone gets activated, they get a cut. There you
go. Who would have guessed?
In some way, so I'm sure they're loving that, much to Google's chagrin, I would say. Going to Windows Phone, the thing I'd love to hear what you think about this, Steve. That the thing I really appreciate about what Microsoft's done with that is that they've made it totally different to the iPhone. They've actually, got in a room and actually thought about making something different.
Yeah, completely agree. Look, we reviewed Windows 8, and I think from what I can see is that Windows Phone is, basically the same tiled sort of system, and it is different, and I think that's really refreshing.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so I guess we can probably start wrapping it up too. Just one last thought on Windows Phone is that it's going to become really interesting once the Windows Phone on Nokia phones start really entering the marketplace, sort of tying in with the release of Windows 8 next year. It should become very interesting in terms of how the market goes. I think that they could be a bit of a wild card, I think, if they're able to pull together all those elements. I'm thinking they're not going to maybe outdo Apple, but maybe they could really carve themselves out a decent part of the market.
Isn't that if Nokia can last that long?
Yeah, exactly. There's still a lot of ifs in there. But all right, well, thanks again for the chat, Steve. Always good. And I'm looking at my timer on my iPhone 4, which still looks like an iPhone 4 and iPhone 4S or something like that. So don't forget our website is available at www.fistchat.com. Get all our links there, and we'll be back again next week. So until then, have a good week.